Imagine a whole county, locking its windows at night, burning its own wells, because of what one dead woman hid beneath her floor. 31 clay jars. No one dared speak her name aloud. Until the day they dug her up. This is the story they tried to bury with her. The night air in Rutherford County, Middle Tennessee, carried a weight heavier than August humidity in 1849. It pressed against the shutters of every white planter's house like an unseen hand. For nearly a decade, men who owned hundreds of acres and dozens of souls refused to sleep with their windows open. They posted extra patrols, armed white boys no older than 16, walking the tree lines with lanterns that bobbed like uneasy fireflies. They stopped drawing water from certain wells after their children woke screaming from dreams they could not name. And when the livestock began to die, not quickly, but in slow, wasting agonies that made the animals thrash and foam under the moonlight, first the mules in the eastern pastures, then the milk cows closer to the big house, the planters simply nodded to one another across fence lines and said nothing to outsiders. Because the explanation they had arrived at was one no man of standing could repeat without sounding mad. They believed the source of the terror was a woman who had owned nothing, who could neither read nor write, who possessed no legal name beyond the one her enslaver had scratched into a ledger. A woman who had been dead for almost 2 years by the time the fear reached its choking peak. Her name, as it survived in a single yellowed estate ledger later pulled from a Nashville archive in 1931, was Celia. But among the people who shared her chains, the name that passed in careful whispers carried the soft, rounded sound of Saa, a name with roots older than the cotton fields, older than the Bible the white preachers waved, older than the stones of this county itself. In the autumn of 1849, after a killing drought and the discovery of 31 clay jars sealed beneath the floorboards of a slave cabin on Harlan Pute's plantation, the white families of Rutherford County came to believe that Celia had done something to them. Something they could not name. Something they could not undo. Something they could not name. Something they could not undo. Something they could not prove with any law written by men. What they found inside those jars changed forever how they understood the years that had come before. And what they never found, what was never recovered, never explained, never fully accounted for, is what kept them afraid long after the jars were smashed, the cabin burned to the ground, and the ashes scattered into the Stones River. Before we step deeper into the shadow of those 31 jars, if this story has never reached your ears, if no elder in your family ever lowered their voice to speak it, I ask you right now, subscribe. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of history that powerful men tried to bury 6 feet deeper than any coffin. Drop a comment with the state you're listening from. Let's begin. Middle Tennessee in 1849 was not the romantic South of moonlight and magnolias. It was a land of calculated prosperity built on deep, systemic violence, the kind the ledgers never fully recorded. The great cotton and tobacco plantations that had minted fortunes in the 1820s and 30s were beginning to groan under exhausted soil and shifting markets. Yet the institution that kept the money flowing, human bondage, remained ironclad, protected by law, by rifle, by the unspoken agreement that every white neighbor was also an enforcer. Rutherford County lay roughly 30 miles southeast of Nashville, bisected by the Stones River. Rolling limestone hills, red clay that clung to boots like gilt, and summers so humid the air itself felt like it was sweating. It was not the largest slaveholding county in Tennessee, but it was among the most tightly controlled. A culture of surveillance had hardened over 2 generations, neighbors reported neighbors, overseers traded information like currency, and any flicker of defiance, real or imagined, was punished not just to break one body, but to crush the spirit of an entire quarters. The Pute plantation sprawled across 800 acres on the county's eastern edge, following a creek that every August shrank to a muddy whisper. Harlan Pute, 53 years old in 1849, had inherited the land from his father and expanded it with the same cold patience he applied to everything. The white community called him firm but fair, words that, in antebellum Tennessee, meant he did not torture people in public view, that he fed the enslaved adequately during harvest, and that he preferred to sell rather than whip when discipline was required. A gentleman's cruelty, wrapped in the language of Christian mercy. He kept 61 people in bondage that year. Among them was the woman he called Celia. But the name she answered to in the dark, when the day's last bell had rung and the lanterns were low, was Saa. A name that carried the echo of West African naming traditions, names that remembered ancestors, not owners. She had lived on Pute land for at least 18 years. The ledger listed her as domestic and herb woman, polite shorthand for the person who cooked, cleaned, nursed the sick, and carried knowledge of roots, barks, and leaves that could either heal or something else. That last skill was not incidental. It was the axis on which everything turned. The summer of 1849 arrived on the heels of a nervous spring. Newspapers read aloud in white parlors spoke of European revolutions and the sharpening knife edge of slavery's expansion into Mexican territories. In Rutherford County, these distant storms felt like distant thunder, yet they added to the background hum of dread that the world was shifting in ways the plantation system was never built to survive. Closer to home, conditions in the quarters had deteriorated sharply over the previous 5 years. Intensive cotton and tobacco farming without rotation had bled the soil dry. Smaller yields meant thinner rations, thinner blankets, shorter nights of rest. Infant mortality in the slave quarters had climbed in ways the county physician noted coldly as constitutionally weak stock. The same doctor who would later examine the jars could not bring himself to name the true cause: slow, grinding starvation and despair. Celia watched it all from the strange, dangerous vantage of the medicine woman. Her role gave her access no one else possessed. She moved through the big house and the quarters like smoke, necessary, invisible, indispensable. She knew which children were wasting away and which plants could coax life back into their small bodies. She knew which women carried children who would never draw breath and which births would tear mothers apart. She knew the exact sound a body makes when it is being slowly poisoned by overwork, by grief, by the invisible weight of chains that had no iron links. Most of all, she knew how to be unseen in a world that depended on unseen labor. She cooked for the fevered. She sat with the dying. She pressed warm cloths to foreheads in rooms where the white family above her never once looked down. She had memorized every creak of every floorboard in the big house. She knew which windows caught the first cruel light of dawn and which corners stayed cold even in July. Plant medicine among the enslaved was never just medicine. It was memory. It was resistance. It was power disguised as service. White enslavers feared it even while they depended on it, because the same hands that could ease a fever could, in theory, stop a heart. Centuries of forced labor in fields and forests had given the enslaved an encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world that no doctor in Nashville could match. And every planter understood, in the part of his soul he never admitted to, that the people he owned still carried something he could never buy or break. For at least a decade, Celia had been the Butte plantation's primary healer. She had delivered babies, both black and, on 2 documented occasions, white. She had fought typhoid and dysentery outbreaks that swept the county like divine judgment. By any honest measure, she was essential to the survival of the entire operation. Then, in late winter 1847, she died. The ledger recorded it in 3 brutal words: Celia deceased February. No cause. No age. No ceremony. No grave marker. Just a line in a book. The 31 jars were not discovered until November 1849, nearly 2 full years after her death, during a renovation of the very cabin she had occupied alone for the last decade of her life. By the time Harlan Butte understood what he was looking at, it was already far too late to contain the meaning. The autumn of 1849 had been merciless. The summer drought had scorched the corn and left the tobacco thin and worthless. Several of Butte's enslaved workers had died of what the records called summer fever, a catch-all term that could hide malaria, typhoid, heatstroke, or simple exhaustion. Without Celia, illness in the quarters had spiraled. Butte had twice sent for a Nashville physician who showed little interest in treating property. The doctor's remedies were blunt and useless. In this atmosphere of loss, bad harvest, fresh graves, the long shadow of winter, Butte ordered the slave quarters expanded. 2 new cabins. Repairs to the old ones. The cabin Celia had lived in was scheduled for a new floor, new walls, a larger hearth. On a Wednesday in early November, the work crew, 4 enslaved men under the eye of overseer Caleb Denning, began ripping up the old floorboards. The planks were rotted, heavy with years of moisture from the clay beneath. At first they found only compacted earth, roots, the ordinary debris of lived life. Then a mattock struck something harder than dirt. The first jar was 8 inches tall, sealed with a plug of rendered tallow that had hardened into a waxy, yellowish cap. It had not been hidden with dramatic secrecy, it had simply been placed at a depth where the floorboards concealed it completely. When the worker lifted it, something inside shifted with a dry, papery rattle like seeds in a dried gourd. He carried it to Denning. Denning, a man whose authority rested on institutional violence rather than respect, stared at the jar for a long moment. His face did not change, but something in his eyes did. He told the men to keep digging. Over the next 3 hours they found all 31. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern beneath the entire floor, lines radiating from the 4 walls toward the center, each jar spaced roughly 2 feet from the next. Some small enough to cradle in one palm. Others that required both hands. Every single one sealed with the same tallow. Every single one containing something. Harlan Pute was summoned from the big house. He arrived to find Denning standing outside the cabin door with an expression the planter would later describe in a letter as unsettled in a way I had not seen on the man before. The jars had been lifted out and lined up in the pale November light like evidence at a trial no one wanted to hold. Pute opened the first one himself. What he found inside varied from vessel to vessel, and it was the variation that turned his stomach. Some contained dried roots, seeds, bark fragments, bundles of herbs tied with thread. Some held small bones the plantation physician could not identify as animal or otherwise. Several contained folded scraps of cloth, pieces of clothing, colors that suggested they had come from garments belonging to different people across the county. One held a single lock of dark hair, coiled tight and bound with leather. Another contained salt mixed with a dark, bitter-smelling powder that made the men step back. And several, the detail that would haunt Pute until the day he died, contained folded pieces of paper. Celia could not read. Celia could not write. Every white person on the property and for miles around knew this as fact, the same way they knew the names of their horses or the boundaries of their fields. It was a crime in Tennessee to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Yet here, inside the jars buried beneath the floor of her cabin, were papers. Folded papers. Papers with marks on them. Denning leaned in close. The marks were not letters. Not words. They were something older, symbols, lines, circles, crosses that seemed to twist and breathe in the weak afternoon light. Marks that looked like they had been drawn by a hand that knew secrets the Bible never taught. Pute felt the first cold finger of something he could not name trace down his spine. Because if Celia had not written them, then who had, and if she had, then what else had the woman they thought they owned been hiding for 18 years? The wind shifted across the fields. Somewhere in the distance a mule screamed once and fell silent. The 31 jars had only just begun to speak. The marks on the folded papers were not letters from any alphabet Harlan Pute recognized. They were not numbers. They were not crude drawings of people or animals. They were deliberate symbols, circles intersected by lines, repeating crosses, spiraling patterns rendered in what looked like charcoal mixed with something darker, almost oily. The arrangement carried an unmistakable sense of purpose, as though the hand that made them had been speaking a language older than the English the white men spoke, older than the King James Bible they preached from, older than the chains they used to bind bodies. Pute refolded the paper with the same care a man might use handling a loaded pistol. He stared down the long row of 31 jars lined up in the weak November light like silent witnesses at a trial. Then he looked at his overseer, Caleb Denning, whose face had gone the color of old ash. "Carry them to the smokehouse," Pute said quietly. "Lock the door. And say nothing, to anyone in the quarters." But it was already too late. Word moved through the slave quarters faster than any white man could track. Not through shouts or open conversation, but in the way information has always traveled among people living under constant watch, in the brief touch of hands while passing a water bucket, in glances across the rows of cotton, in the careful language of indirection that enslaved communities had perfected into an art form. Decades of forced closeness, sleeping shoulder to shoulder in shared cabins, working side by side in the fields, eating from the same iron pots, had created a network of understanding that operated entirely beneath the notice of overseers. By the time the sun dipped below the limestone hills that evening, every adult in the quarters knew that Celia's floor had been torn up and that the things she had buried there had been taken away. Their reactions were not the same. Some felt a cold spike of fear, not of the jars themselves, but of what white terror always brought next. History had taught them that when a planter grew afraid, he did not suffer alone. He made sure the fear was shared, violently, across every back on the place. Others allowed themselves a quiet, private satisfaction they would never voice aloud. A small, fierce light in the eyes that said, she left something behind. The older women who had known Celia best said nothing at all. And in that silence was a message louder than any shout: we already understand what this is. And we will not explain it to those who would only use it as another reason to punish us. To the white community of Rutherford County, the word that began to spread carefully, in lowered voices around supper tables and after church, was conjure. It was their imprecise, fearful label for a vast, living web of spiritual and practical traditions that had crossed the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships and refused to die. These traditions drew from West and Central African roots, from native knowledge of the southern plants, and from a Christianity that the enslaved had reshaped in the secret hush arbors into something that spoke to their suffering rather than their master's comfort. Conjure was never one thing. It lived at the crossroads of medicine, psychology, and the unseen world. It used roots, bones, hair, dirt, and intention the way a blacksmith uses fire and hammer. It understood that what is buried can still affect what walks above ground. The 31 jars were not random collections of junk. The pattern beneath the floorboards, lines radiating inward like spokes of a wheel, was no decoration. Each object had been chosen and placed with purpose, to protect, to bind, to warn, or perhaps to punish. The white families did not need to understand the specifics. The fear worked because so much remained unknowable. If Celia had buried these things with intention, what exactly had she intended? And if even a few of those jars had been aimed at the people who owned her, what damage had already been done? Because strange things had happened on the Pute place, things that, once the jars were found, refused to be seen as coincidence. Harlan Pute's eldest son, Thomas, had died in 1844 at the age of 26. A strong, healthy young man expected to inherit the entire plantation. He was gone in 11 days from a fever that came on suddenly in the dead of winter and would not break, no matter what remedies were tried. Fevers killed people in Tennessee, of course. But Thomas had died in February, and Celia had never left his bedside for those 11 days. She had mixed the teas, applied the poultices, wiped the sweat from his burning forehead while the family prayed in the next room. Then there was the daughter, Martha. Married in 1843 to Weston Gorley from a neighboring county, a financially smart match that quickly turned into private hell. Gorley had a reputation for violence that his family tried to hide and that his wife had no legal escape from. In 1845, on a perfectly calm morning right across flat ground, his horse inexplicably threw him. He struck his head on a fence post at just the wrong angle and died within hours. Martha returned to her father's house a widow at 24. No one in polite company used the word relief, but her eyes carried it for months afterward like a secret she finally dared to breathe. In 1846 a fire had ripped through the main barn in the middle of the night, killing 12 horses and 2 mules. It had come dangerously close to the big house before the wind suddenly shifted at midnight, shifting in the exact direction several workers later admitted to one another they had somehow expected it to shift. They never spoke of it to the overseers. Each event, taken alone, had a rational explanation. Fevers happened. Horses threw riders. Barns caught fire. But once the jars were discovered, the pattern became impossible to unsee. The imagination of men who had spent decades enforcing total control now turned against them, filling in the gaps with every quiet resentment, every unexplained death, every night they had slept uneasily. By the winter of 1849, Harlan Pute had become convinced that Celia had done something to his family and his land. Not through ghosts or devils, he told himself and his brother-in-law that he was not a superstitious man, but through knowledge and intention he could neither name nor understand. The jars were proof that her will had outlived her body. He did not know how many of those jars were still working. In the weeks that followed, Pute made decisions that showed how deeply the discovery had unsettled him. He rode to Nashville and consulted a physician named Dr. Aldous Fenwick, presenting samples from several jars without revealing where they had come from. Dr. Fenwick examined the materials with the careful eye of a man who knew he was being asked something dangerous. He identified pennyroyal, capable of inducing miscarriage, toxic in higher doses. Jimsonweed, its alkaloids could bring delirium, irregular heartbeat, and death. Black cohosh, used for women's troubles, but with powerful effects on the heart. Foxglove, the source of digitalis, healing the heart in tiny amounts, stopping it in larger ones. Tansy, an abortifacient and, in concentrated form, a poison that could mimic organ failure. The doctor wrote back in careful, measured language, the way men write when they suspect their words might one day be read in a courtroom. He noted that a person with deep botanical knowledge could use these plants to cause illness or death that would appear completely natural: fever, heart failure, the slow wasting that was so common in the region and so rarely questioned. He added that the knowledge displayed was not casual. It was sophisticated. Whoever had gathered and preserved these materials understood not only which plants affected the body, but how they interacted, how dosage and timing changed outcomes, and how to keep their power alive even after being dried and sealed for years. Pute read the letter 3 times. He thought of Thomas lying in that bed, burning with fever while Celia moved silently around him. He thought of the teas she had brewed for the sick, the broths she had recommended, the poultices she had applied. He thought of the freedom of movement her role as healer had given her, access to every room, every cup, every vulnerable moment in the big house. And then the thought he could never speak aloud crept in. Perhaps I only survived because she had not yet decided to reach me. That single idea began to eat away at his sleep. Night after night he lay awake in the room where his own father had died, listening to the house settle, the creak of joists in the cold, the specific groan of the floorboard near the east window. He began keeping a mental ledger of every death, every illness, every accident on the place for the past 18 years, asking himself whether the outcome could have been different if the dose had been slightly stronger, if the recovery had been allowed to falter at just the right moment. He was torturing himself with questions he could never answer, because the real evidence, if it had ever existed, had long since been absorbed into bodies now buried, or burned in the hearth, or scattered back into the red clay soil. Whatever Celia had done, she had done it cleanly. She had left exactly the traces she chose to leave, and nothing more. That realization, that a woman they had considered illiterate and powerless had outmaneuvered them so completely, kept him awake more than any ghost ever could. Meanwhile, the story of the 31 jars had escaped the Pute property. Overseer Denning told his wife. His wife told women at the Methodist Church in Laverne. Within 6 weeks, the outline was known across most of the white families in Rutherford County. An enslaved woman had buried 31 jars of conjure materials, some of them poisons. Pute's son had died strangely. There had been a suspicious fire. Details grew wilder with every telling. By January 1850, versions in Murfreesboro claimed the jars had contained human bones or pieces of bodies. A Nashville correspondent heard that the papers carried writing no scholar could decipher. The fear had taken on a life of its own. And somewhere beneath it all, the question no one could silence kept whispering. If one dead woman could do this much with 31 jars, what else had she set in motion that they had not yet discovered? Wild rumors raced through Rutherford County faster than any truth ever could. Some claimed several of the jars had held living creatures that withered and died the moment fresh air touched them. Others swore the papers carried ancient curses written in blood. None of it was true, but accuracy no longer mattered. The story had become something far more powerful than facts. It was transferring the terror of an entire system, built on whips, chains, broken families, and constant surveillance, back onto the very people who had created it. For decades the white landowning class had believed they saw everything. They watched every movement, listened to every conversation, punished every flicker of defiance. Yet here was proof that something profound had been happening right under their feet, invisible, methodical, and completely beyond their control. That was the true poison in the 31 jars. Not the plants. Not the symbols. Not even the bones. The implication that their power had always had limits a woman they had dismissed as illiterate and powerless had quietly exploited for 18 years. Back on the Pute plantation, the surviving enslaved people watched the growing white panic with careful, hidden attention. Those who had known Celia, who had received her remedies, who had sometimes heard her low, steady instructions in the dark, carried a new stillness in their bodies. They were not openly defiant. They did not speak rebellion. But something had shifted in the invisible arithmetic of fear. Several of the older women now moved as though they carried less weight on their shoulders than before. One woman in particular drew the overseer's sharpie eye, and in the estate ledger she was listed simply as Old Ruth, though she was no more than 45. The word old was the casual cruelty slaveholders used to diminish any woman past her peak field value. Ruth had been Celia's closest companion for at least 10 years. She had helped mix medicines, had stood beside her at births and deathbeds, had learned the careful art of turning roots and leaves into healing, or something else. After the jars were discovered, Ruth stopped meeting Caleb Denning's eyes entirely. Not with fear. With something colder, the quiet decision that he was no longer worth the effort of pretending to respect. Denning reported it to Harlan Pute. Pute ordered him to watch her closely. What Denning observed over the following days unsettled him more than any outburst could have. Ruth moved through the property in a new, deliberate pattern. She took longer routes between the quarters and the fields, routes that brought her past certain trees, certain fence posts, certain patches of bare ground. At each spot she would pause for just a moment, her head slightly tilted, as though listening or checking. Denning began tracking her movements. The pattern became unmistakable. He told Pute he had the uneasy feeling that Ruth was inspecting something. That she knew exactly where things were hidden that no white man on the property had ever thought to look for. The question that now haunted every planter who heard the story was simple and terrifying. Had Celia buried only 31 jars? In February 1850, Harlan Pute organized a second, far more thorough search of his entire property. He led it himself, accompanied by Denning and 3 men he trusted completely. They moved systematically through every building, the quarters, the smokehouse, the corn crib, the 2 new barns that had replaced the one destroyed by fire. They pulled up floorboards, dug test holes at regular intervals, probed beneath porches and along interior walls. They found nothing. Then Pute made a decision that revealed how deeply the fear had eaten into him. He ordered the main house searched. This was no small thing. The big house was the sanctuary of the White family, the place where his wife, his widowed daughter Martha, and his 2 surviving young sons slept, ate, and tried to live as though they still controlled their world. It was the one building where an enslaved woman was never supposed to have had the freedom or the time to hide anything. Yet Celia had moved through those rooms for years. She had nursed illnesses there. She had attended the births of Pute's grandchildren. She had walked the kitchen, the downstairs parlors, the upstairs corridor during long nights of care. She had been inside the very heart of the house that owned her. The search took 2 full days. They checked beneath every floorboard in the kitchen, where the planks rested directly on packed earth. They probed the cellar. They examined the spaces beneath staircases and behind interior walls where construction gaps existed. In the end, they found one more jar. It was the smallest of all, small enough to rest in the palm of a hand. It had been carefully placed in the narrow gap between 2 floor joists in the room that had once been the main bedroom during Harlan Pute's father's final years. Later it had become a sewing room for his wife. And it was the same room where Thomas, Pute's eldest son, the heir, had been nursed during his fatal 11-day fever in 1844. The jar was still sealed with hardened tallow. When Pute opened it himself, his hands were not steady. Inside lay 2 things. A small bundle of dried plant material tied neatly with thread. And a single human tooth. It was a back molar, root intact. Large enough to have belonged to a grown man. Not a child's tooth. The kind of tooth that would leave a noticeable gap if it had been pulled from a living mouth. Pute sat on the edge of the bed that had once belonged to his father and held the tooth in his open palm for a very long time. He was thinking about Thomas. About the fever that had come in winter. About Celia never leaving the boy's bedside for 11 days. About the tea she had prepared, the cloth she had wrung out, the quiet words she had spoken while the family prayed in the next room. He was thinking about what a tooth meant. What the absence of a tooth might mean. And whether anyone had ever checked the body before it was placed in the family plot. He never ordered the grave opened. 6 years had passed. Social custom, family dignity, and perhaps simple dread stopped him. But he kept the tiny jar separate from the others, locked inside a wooden box in his private study. From that day forward, Harlan Pute began to lose small pieces of himself. He had trouble remembering whether he had locked certain doors. He forgot conversations he had only minutes earlier. He questioned the order of events he had once remembered clearly. He blamed sleeplessness. And it was true, he barely slept. He barely ate. The fear that had entered him was not the sharp terror of a single night. It was a slow, corrosive drip, the realization that for nearly 2 decades something had been happening all around him that he had been completely unable to see. And he could not be certain it had stopped. Meanwhile, word of the second search and especially of the jar found inside the main house spread quickly to neighboring plantations. The reaction was not the calm reassurance Pute might have hoped for from other men of standing. Instead, it was a mirror of his own dread. Within 6 weeks, 2 neighboring planters ordered full searches of their own quarters. A third went further. He brought in a physician to review the medical histories of every enslaved person who had died on his property in the past 5 years, looking for any pattern that might suggest something other than natural causes. The doctor's report was carefully worded and deeply ambiguous. Several deaths had shown symptoms consistent with plant poisoning. He could not prove anything unnatural had occurred, but he could not rule out the possibility either. That was enough. By the spring of 1850, the entire white landholding community of Rutherford County had slipped into a state of sustained, low-level dread. Practical changes followed quickly. Extra night patrols around the quarters. Stricter limits on movement between neighboring plantations. New layers of surveillance on the women who worked as healers and domestics, the very women who, like Celia, possessed knowledge that now made them both essential and terrifying. The terror created by 31 clay jars had become, in the most ironic way possible, another tool of control. A tighter chain forged from fear of the very resistance those jars may have represented. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all was this. What if Celia had known exactly what would happen when the jars were found? The fragile resolution, if it could be called that, came not from Harlan Pute or Caleb Denning, but from a free black woman named Lucy Tenant. Lucy was one of the small number of free people of color living in precarious freedom in antebellum Tennessee. Around 60 years old, she had worked as a midwife across 3 counties for nearly 4 decades. She had known Celia, not well, not recently, but enough. They had crossed paths 5 or 6 times over the years when difficult births required both women's skills. Their relationship had been one of careful, professional respect between 2 women doing the same dangerous work under very different conditions, one still enslaved, the other technically free but bound by laws and social hostility that made her freedom feel paper-thin. In the spring of 1850, Martha Pute, Harlan's widowed daughter, reached out to Lucy through channels the historical record leaves deliberately vague. Martha had become consumed by the questions surrounding the jars. Her father was visibly deteriorating. The younger sons were frightened. The plantation no longer felt like a place of inheritance but like a place of consequence. Martha needed to understand what they were really facing, not in terms of property or county reputation, but in terms of truth. She met Lucy twice, in the late afternoons of 2 consecutive Saturdays, beside the Stones River in a secluded spot shielded by thick pawpaw and river birch. What exactly passed between the 2 women in that dappled spring light, 2 women of vastly different stations speaking carefully about things that could destroy them both, remains mostly lost to history. What survives is an unfinished letter Martha began writing to a cousin in Virginia but never sent. It breaks off mid-sentence on the 3rd page. Whether she stopped because she ran out of courage or because she finally understood something too dangerous to commit to paper, we cannot know. But the fragments she left behind tell us this. She had begun to see Celia not simply as a slave or a conjure-woman, but as someone who had kept an accounting of her own. And in that accounting, the 31 jars were only part of a much larger ledger. According to the fragments of Martha Pute's unsent letter, Lucy Tenant spoke with quiet authority beside the Stones River that spring afternoon in 1850. The 2 women sat in the shifting light filtering through pawpaw leaves, the water moving slow and dark behind them. The jars were not curses, Lucy said. They were not weapons. At least, not in the way you fear. She paused, choosing her words like someone who had spent a lifetime measuring doses that could heal or harm. They were a record. Celia, she explained, had spent the final decade of her life doing something no literate soul on the Pute plantation had ever imagined possible. She had been documenting meticulously, deliberately, not with ink and paper she was forbidden to touch, but in the material language of her own tradition. In the routes she chose, the bones she saved, the scraps of cloth, the symbols she drew, and the precise arrangement of 31 vessels beneath her floor. She had been keeping an account of everything she knew and everything she had witnessed. Some of it was medical knowledge, hard-won expertise passed down and refined through generations of necessity. The plant bundles were not random conjure. They were carefully preserved preparations, organized by purpose. Foxglove for heart conditions. Black cohosh for difficult labors. Pennyroyal in measured amounts for specific uses, separated from the more dangerous portions by subtle markings scratched into the hardened tallow seals, markings invisible to anyone who did not already know how to read them. Celia had been preserving knowledge against the certainty of her own death. Creating an inheritance in the only form available to her, something that could be passed to the women who would come after, in a world that allowed enslaved people no property, no legacy, no future beyond labor and silence. But not all the jars held medicine. The scraps of cloth, Lucy continued, were not random rags. Each piece had been taken from the clothing of a specific person, white or black, serving as a marker of association, a thread connecting an event to a face, to a name, to a moment in time. The small bones were timestamps. The remains of animals that had died or been slaughtered on the property, a horse that collapsed on a particular night, a dog that sickened in a certain season, a pig butchered the same week something else of importance occurred. They anchored memory to date and place, sealed inside clay so the connection could not be broken. And the papers with their strange symbols? They were the clearest part of the record. Not an alphabet in the way white people understood writing, but a notation system Celia had developed or carried from older traditions. Symbols that would speak clearly to anyone trained in that language and remain meaningless, mere scratches, to those who were not. Taken together, the 31 jars formed a document. A testimony. An archive offered to the future in the only tongue the law had left her. What exactly did they record? Martha's letter does not say. Lucy either did not reveal the full truth or Martha chose not to commit it to paper. The letter breaks off at precisely this point, a deliberate silence that feels heavier than any confession. But the implication is unmistakable. From her unique position at the center of the plantation's medical and domestic life, Celia had seen everything. She had moved like smoke through the big house, present but never acknowledged as fully human. She had heard conversations never meant for her ears. She had witnessed illnesses, treatments, final hours. She had stood beside deathbeds and noted every symptom, every word spoken, every decision made when no one thought she was truly listening. She had not buried accusations. She had buried evidence. Sealed in clay and tallow. Arranged in a pattern that would speak only to those who knew how to listen. The single tooth in the tiny jar found between the joists of the sewing room where Thomas Pute had burned with fever for 11 days was not necessarily Thomas's own tooth. It may have been a marker of something larger, a witness placed in that exact location because of what had unfolded in that room during those 11 days. A silent reminder that Celia had been there, watching, remembering. Whatever truth it guarded had been important enough for her to risk hiding it inside the heart of the master's house itself. Martha Pute left those 2 meetings beside the river changed, though not in the way she had expected. She wrote, "I left less certain about what I thought I knew, but differently uncertain, as though I had been frightened of the wrong things all along." She described how she had once seen Celia as little more than a fixture in the household, always present, rarely considered as someone with an inner life as rich and complex as her own. The discovery of the jars had shattered that illusion. She had shared a roof with a woman for years and had never truly seen her. She found herself thinking less about the contents of the jars and more about the sheer will it had taken to create them. To spend years, one careful act at a time, building this hidden architecture beneath a floor she did not own, in soil she did not own, inside a body whose every movement and every scrap of knowledge was considered the legal property of another. What did it mean that a woman with no legal existence, no recognized name, no right to the knowledge she carried, had still found a way to ensure that knowledge would not vanish when she did? Martha burned the letter, or thought she did. What survived was an incomplete draft, folded and hidden inside the spine of a family Bible. It was discovered decades later by the same archivist who found the estate ledger in 1931. He knew he had something significant the moment Martha referenced the exact number, 31. In June 1850, Harlan Pute ordered Celia's cabin demolished and burned to the ground. The 31 jars locked in the smokehouse were smashed, their contents scattered to the wind, the shards of clay buried deep. The small jar from the main house he destroyed separately, in private. No record remains of exactly how. In the spring of 1853, citing failing health and exhaustion, Pute sold the entire plantation. He moved with his wife and younger sons to Memphis. Martha refused to go. She remained in Rutherford County for the rest of her life, eventually purchasing a modest house in Laverne, where she lived quietly until her death in 1879. The records never explain why she chose to stay so close to the land that had begun to feel like a reckoning. The fear that had gripped the white community of Rutherford County did not vanish overnight. It lingered well into the 1850s, hardening into tighter surveillance, stricter controls, and harsher restrictions on the very women who carried healing knowledge. Once again, the response to invisible resistance fell hardest on those who had the least to do with creating it, yet among the enslaved and later freed communities, the understanding was different, more layered, more protective. In the 1890s, when Fisk University researchers interviewed elderly survivors of Tennessee slavery, several accounts quietly pointed back to the events on the Pute place, though no names were spoken aloud. One 90-year-old woman in Nashville remembered. There was a woman down in that county who kept everything in jars. What she saw and what she knew, what she was afraid would get lost. When they found it, the white folks got scared because they didn't know what was in there. But those of us who knew her, we knew. She wasn't doing anything to them. She was keeping things safe for us. What exactly she kept safe, what truths were sealed in those symbols, those plants, those fragments of cloth and bone and that single tooth, has been lost to deliberate destruction. The man most frightened by the record was the one who destroyed it. It is an old story, the powerful erasing the evidence that threatens their version of events. But something refused to die. Lucy Tenant continued her work as a midwife through the Civil War and into Reconstruction. Multiple accounts describe her as extraordinarily skilled, teaching younger women the arts of healing in midwifery. Whether any of Celia's knowledge, any part of that notation system or the careful preservations had been passed to her before the jars were smashed remains unknowable. What is clear is that the tradition itself survived. The expertise of the essential and the unseen, of those who moved through rooms others ignored and noticed what others refused to see, did not disappear when the clay vessels were broken. The 31 jars are gone. Whatever specific testimony they held about the deaths, the secrets, and the daily realities inside the Pute house over 18 years was deliberately erased by the hand that feared it most. Yet Celia had achieved something deeper. She had kept safe the fact of her own existence, her intelligence, her observation, her quiet intention, in a world engineered to render all of it invisible. 31 jars buried in red clay, sealed in tallow, arranged with painstaking care beneath a floor she did not own. Evidence that she had been there. Evidence that she had seen. Evidence that she had known exactly what she was doing. You will not find her in any grand history book. You will not find her grave or the name she chose for herself among her own people. The official record contains only 3 cold words: Celia, deceased February. But for nearly a decade after her death, an entire county of powerful men locked their windows at night and refused to drink from certain wells, because of her. And maybe that tells you everything worth knowing. In the end, the most powerful resistance is not always the one that destroys. It is the one that cannot be fully erased, the one that lives on in what was witnessed, what was remembered, and what was quietly passed forward. Celia kept things safe. Not just knowledge. Not just a record. She kept safe the truth that she had lived, seen, and refused to be forgotten. What do you believe the jars truly held? A simple archive of medicine and memory, or something far more dangerous? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If this story shook something loose in you, if it made you reconsider whose voices history chooses to silence and whose it allows to speak, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear these buried truths. The next story is already waiting, and it's just as dark. Evidence that she had seen. Evidence that she had known exactly what she was doing. You will not find her in any grand history book. You will not find her grave or the name she chose for herself among her own people. The official record contains only 3 cold words: Celia, deceased February. But for nearly a decade after her death, an entire county of powerful men locked their windows at night and refused to drink from certain wells, because of her. And maybe that tells you everything worth knowing. In the end, the most powerful resistance is not always the one that destroys. It is the one that cannot be fully erased, the one that lives on in what was witnessed, what was remembered, and what was quietly passed forward. Celia kept things safe. Not just knowledge. Not just a record. She kept safe the truth that she had lived, seen, and refused to be forgotten. What do you believe the jars truly held? A simple archive of medicine and memory, or something far more dangerous? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If this story shook something loose in you, if it made you reconsider whose voices history chooses to silence and whose it allows to speak, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear these buried truths. The next story is already waiting, and it's just as dark.